Hi everyone, welcome to everyone who's joining us. We're just waiting a couple more minutes for a few more people that we've got signed on to join us. So if you just bear with us a little while a few more people join us.
Did you not? No, he'll not be allowing you. It's a webinar.
Hi, welcome everyone who's joining us for our webinar on animal health and common grazing. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for a few more people to join us because we've got quite a lot of people signed on tonight, and we're waiting for a few more of them to join before I sort of kick off and introduce things. So if you just bear with us for a couple more minutes, and then hopefully very soon we will get going. We'll have a few more people joining us, and we'll get going. Hi, welcome to everyone who's joining us for our webinar on animal health and common grazing. I'm hoping we'll have a few more participants joining because we've got quite a lot of people signed on tonight, but the webinar is also open, will be recorded, so anyone who wants to catch up on this afterwards on YouTube can do so. Really interesting webinar tonight, hopefully, around animal health and common grazing. So I won't say too much, but as we know, common grazing has brings some specific challenges around livestock and animal health, particularly with large unfenced areas, intermingling of stock from different farms, but also with the nature of commons and their historic sort of how they've historically came about as manurial waste, as the sort of technical term, but largely unimproved grasslands and unimproved semi-natural habitats can lead to issues around nutrition and lower density of nutrition in fodder than you'd expect on other habitats. Plus, with so many commons being in schemes or designated as SSSIs or SACs, there may not be the access to supplementary feeding that you'd have on other grazing systems. So we're going to be exploring that from a few different angles today with some really interesting speakers who I will introduce as they get going. I just wanted to start with a few very brief sort of housekeeping things. So this is part of a series of webinars from the Foundation for Common Lands around different issues affecting upland commons. So please do look out on our website and on our Twitter and join up to our email list to find out about more webinars. So with regards to this webinar, as I said, it is being recorded. So as a participant, you're not actually shown on that, but you can put your questions in the Q&A. So please don't put something in the Q&A unless you're happy for it to be recorded and for it to show in the recorded webinar afterwards. So there's a Q&A and a chat on these webinars. And what we ask is, can you use the Q&A for your questions? And the chat, just keep through if you're having any IT issues, or as some people have, if you want to introduce yourself to everyone else who's here. So just before we get going with the first speaker, could I ask Kira, could you put up a poll for us? It's really useful for us. If you answer this, it lets us know who we have here. So it's just so we can see who's attending these. So yeah, do put your questions for speakers in the Q&A. Speakers will both write answers in the Q&A and will then ask those questions. So if you answer the poll, it will go away from your screen. I'm going to introduce though now our first speaker, David Atwell from the Dartmoor Hill Farming Project, who's going to be talking about a project that has been funded through the Foundation for Common Lands, our Upland Commons project, around blood monitoring, mineral levels in livestock on Dartmoor, and tracking movement to understand sort of nutrition and live weight. So I will, without any more introduction, if we could go to David, please.
Thank you, Sam. I'll just try and share my screen.
Could we turn David's camera on, please, Kira, as well?
Right, okay, is that, can you see that, Sam?
That's great, thank you.
Great, okay, thank you very much, Sam, and good evening, everybody. My role really in this project, I work for the Dartmoor Hill Farm Project based on Dartmoor in the southwest of England, and my role really has been to help facilitate the Healthy Livestock Project along with Tamsin Thomas, who's our local project officer. So what's the project about really? What were we trying to achieve? Well, I think in a nutshell, it's in the name really. It's about trying to improve the health and well-being of livestock grazing in a shared environment on the common. And the motivation for that is not just improving, obviously, the health and well-being of the animal, but also the bottom line. Upland farms are quite financially challenged. I think we're in a very difficult period of change for many of our farm businesses. And I think it's a bit like the analogy of the British cycling team, if you remember all the small changes they made, largely, I think, based around Lycra. I want to hasten to add, we haven't been testing that out, but it's those small little changes that we can make that can improve the bottom line. And we've been doing that really by sitting around discussing the challenges and the opportunities. And I think it's very healthy to get away from individual flock and herd health plans. We tend to do things with vets on our own farms. We don't that often get together as a group. And so in that forum, we've been able to discuss and share our ideas, opportunities and problems, and hopefully use the knowledge and skills within the group. And I think something that's really undervalued in lots of the discussions we have around commons is the knowledge of the grazier. That's often can be lost and overlooked, particularly in the context of things like agri-environment schemes. So we started from that point. What do we know? What do we know about these areas? And then where we've needed expertise and help to come in, we've been able to source that. We've had some great help from our local vets and from AFA and from a number of specialists, which I'll talk about as we go through the project. The other thing I ought to say is actually it's been a really good positive experience. Certainly from my point of view, it's been great to work with a really innovative, forward-thinking group of commoners, and you can see from this image actually that it's been quite multi-generational. We've quite often at our group discussions had 3 generations from 9 years old up to 80, and that's really encouraging and healthy to see. And this project's had a lot of younger commoners who are coming through and are actively engaging on the commons. So the next generation, I think, has been very much a feature of this piece of work. I should also say that in terms of sort of daily live weight gain, most of the participants have put on a lot of weight over the past 2 years, more than the livestock has, I hasten to add, because we've banqueted, I think, our way through this project. We've had fantastic on-farm hospitality, and that's really helped to, I think, get people engaged and to move us forward. And the 2 participating commons that I'm talking about here, I think, participated in the development phase for our commons, and that's Harford and Ludborough, which is a large common down towards Ivy Bridge on the south side of the moor, sort of a long, thin common running up to the edge of the forest, a single association for the two commons, and 6 of the 7 active graziers have been involved in the project, along with two landowners. And then on Holme Moor, just to the northeast, you can see towards the centre of Dartmoor, another common, 1 association, and we're working with 4 of the 6 cattle and sheep graziers on that common. I want to emphasise actually that through the Healthy Livestock Project, although there is a lot of 3 species grazing on Dartmoor, so ponies are very much a feature of the commons, we have focused purely on cattle and sheep through this project. Both commons have quite a range of habitats, from sort of bog and mire through to sort of acid grassland, heathland, and certainly on Holme down into sort of oakwood. So when we got together initially in our first sort of discussions, I thought we were going to go down the tick route actually, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about tick and tick-related issues. Ironically, that came much more into our current phase of work that we've been doing more recently. But what we did identify, and I think this is the value of the healthy livestock approach, is that in the room, we began to suddenly see that we had some consistent issues and problems. And we identified a problem maybe to do with mortality and performance of lambs really post-weaning. So as lambs came off the common, they were looking very well, coming onto the in-by, and then they just weren't performing really. And we just had this gut feeling that underlying that there was a problem, and I think the group really felt that minerals was the area to look at. So we were given some advice and some recommendations, and we worked with Peter Bone from the Livestock and Grassland Mineral Consultancy, who's a well-known expert in this field, and with Peter's help we put together a programme to investigate what was going on. So how did we do that? Well, you can see from the image on the left-hand side, we started off with epidemiology. So we looked at bloods. We took bloods from adult sheep and from lambs, and we did that at different times of the year. We were very keen to get clean results as sheep came off the common, so that they hadn't had any other inputs or minerals added to their diet. We did the same with cows and with calves. And we looked at protein and energy markers as well within the bloods. We also moved on to look at forage. So we took fresh samples from the common. We got the graziers to take samples from their own in-by grazing platforms. And also we looked at conserved forage. So we got a good idea about what was the mineral contribution from the forage elements. And then in the centre there, you can see water sampling. So we also wanted to understand what was the mineral quality of the water. Was that having an impact on where animals were grazing, where they were loafing, how they were moving around the common? I should say that on Holme Moor, we decided that we would do a little bit of animal tracking. And originally we were looking to do that with GPS collars, but the joys of Dartmoor, we have such poor telephone signal and connectivity, we couldn't get that to work. So we moved to using no-fence collars. No-fence is obviously an invisible fence or a shocking collar. We didn't use it in that format. We just used it purely as a tracking device to enable the graziers to understand where animals were going. And so that when we had our data, we were able to look at that in more detail and perhaps try and tie together 1 or 2 of these different strands. So what were our headlines? I think the first thing I would say is that we found minerals were actually quite challenging, quite scientific, quite complex, and lots of interesting things within there. So things like antagonistic elements like molybdenum and sulfur and copper, things that when they're in combination have different impacts on the rumen. So it was a complex topic, but what we tried to do were pick out the sort of the main headlines, the things that really stood out. I think the first standout thing for me was that when we were looking at things like bloods, we were finding that selenium was very, very high. And the conclusion I think that Peter came to on that was that probably selenium is a fairly common element. It appears in things like cake. You get it obviously in drenches and in licks, and obviously it can be applied in boluses. And so we think gradually through those multiple sources, we were sort of building up the selenium levels without realizing that to really quite very high levels. So that was a sort of a flag for us to start considering what we were doing in that area. We also saw that in terms of bloods, the ewes earlier in the year, they were quite low in energy and protein. So that was a reminder about the importance of managing the ewe around lambing time and post lambing. And then we found that, as an example, within the cows, iodine was quite low. And obviously, iodine is an element associated with not just general good health, but also with fertility. So no one can really afford to carry a barren suckler cow. So again, these are all useful things, getting us thinking a little bit more about what we were doing and how we may address some of these issues. The consistent theme, though, and the thing that I think underpinned our original concern around poor performance of lambs at weaning was cobalts. And we know that cobalts are, a really important element, and where it's deficient, it can have significant impacts. Sheep have probably, twice the requirement for this element than cattle. And we know that cobalt's required by the rumen microorganisms for the synthesis of vitamin B12. And where we get that right, we get really good performance in lambs. So Peter alerted us to vitamin B12 injections, which are available in the UK, but really came out of New Zealand. And we spoke to via Sarah, one of our vets, with the team in New Zealand, and they gave us some advice. And we looked a little bit behind the research and realised that even where you had ewes that had a really good high vitamin B12 status at lambing, if you looked at their lambs 3 or 4 weeks later, they were really quite low in vitamin B12. So we identified 2 products that were available to import to the country. And the 2 that we looked at were Troy or Smart Shot. They come in through, I think, vets in the north of England. And we opted for Smart Shot. And the reason for that is that it has a very long-acting resilience in the injection. So we had to get literally about 6 months out of that injection. And the challenges of managing animals on commons is that obviously we're not gathering and handling those animals very frequently. So Troy really wasn't an option for us because we'd have had to be doing that every couple of months. And talking to Sarah, we developed the idea around doing a bit of a pilot. So we decided we'd take 50 lambs as one cohort to be treated and 50 non-treated lambs. And we would try and pick lambs of obviously similar age, 3 to 4 weeks old ideally, and of similar sex balance and weight. And then those lambs were treated, the 50 were treated, and the cohort of 50 control were turned out on the common. And our aim really was to look primarily at live weight gain. So could we compare between the 2 batches when we gathered them in at clipping time? But also could we look at things like mortality and morbidity as well? I think that's a bit more complex because there's so many factors that impact mortality on the common, but nevertheless, we set out with that ambition. So what we found, I think, is that when we brought the sheep back in and when we compared the results, there was a positive difference actually between those 2 groups. And on average, it was just about 1.8 kilograms of difference in favour of the treated group. And we also were seeing slightly less mortality. I think one of the other interesting things that came out of our discussion was that as a group, as we sat around and we talked about this, we began to realise that there were some other benefits actually from the treated group. So a few of the farms had orth, which is obviously a topical disease or issue for the sheep. And what we saw was that just occurred in the non-treated group, not in the treated group. So the graziers felt there was a definite benefit there. There was also a feeling that the treated group looked better. There was a bit more of a bloom about them. People felt that they were in general better condition, and that clearly may be reflected in the weight gain. The cost of the injection was around about 82 pence a lamb, and working out those values at store lamb values, we equate that to roughly about a £2.37 a head difference for the treated sheep. Just to give you an idea, there was variation in the group, and I think we're looking to hopefully run this pilot again and maybe tighten up around some of the parameters that we used. But the best performing sheep, this is a very low input grazier, so hardy Welsh mountain ewes, the Glamorgan type of Welsh mountain ewes, so very low input system, but a very keen grazier, and he was very, very good about bringing the sheep in and weighing the sheep. And you can see here, if you look at the bar chart, the orange bar is the treated group, and you can see how that gap is beginning to evolve between the control in blue and the treated sheep in orange. And I think if you look to the right and you look at the line chart, you can see how the treated group is starting to pull away from the control group. What's really important about this, I think, is that where that's worked well, in this particular instance, you're looking at a financial difference of over £6 a ewe. And I think if you were looking at that on 250 or 500 or 1,000 lambs, that's a very significant difference. At the other end of the spectrum, I should say all of the treated group produced a profit in comparison to the non-treatment, but you're down to a matter of sort of 12, 14 pence at the lower end of the spectrum. So when you average that out across the pilot, you can see here again the bar chart. This is all of the sheep, and you can see that the treated have made a slight gain on the control group, and you can see how we built our calculations there, the 1.81 kilos and the income difference at £3.19 and the 82 pence for the cost. I should say there's no labour cost built into this, but we felt as a group actually that the pilot was really worthwhile. What we can't evaluate is whether those lambs in better condition when they come off the common, whether they were more resilient to secondary factors that may be impacting, particularly some of the tick-related issues, tick-borne fever as an example. But I think the grazers as a whole were pleased with the pilot, and we would like to repeat that this year. So I think, Sam, that's the end of my slides. I was going to go and interview David and Richard. So
that's brilliant. So if we could have David, and if you could turn your camera on now, David, and if David and Richard could turn their cameras on and unmute as well.
How was that too, Shell?
That's perfect.
Hopefully
Thank you.
Where's my camera turn?
So yes, so David was just going to talk to.
Coming, mate.
Oh.
Right.
Don't worry if you can't get your camera on, David. We'll still be able to hear you. So David was just going to talk to Richard Gray, who is the vice chair of the Holm HLS committee and one of the Holm commoners, and David Mudge, who is also a commoner on Holm. So I will let you go ahead, David.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Yeah, evening, Richard. Hope you're well.
Hello.
Sorry for
Hello, David.
putting you through this. Yeah, I just thought I'd ask you a question. What were the key things that did you learn through the project?
Well, I think it became quite obvious that there's lots and lots of things that add up to making a difference. And if you haven't got the knowledge of what's actually going on with your animals, you only know half the story. And sometimes a little knowledge is dangerous. And I found that myself with some of the blood tests that came back to do with selenium were very interesting. And I was actually poisoning my animals, trying to keep pumping more in because I thought I knew what the problem was, and I was ending up poisoning them. So thank you for saving their lives, David. But no, that was just an example. Finding out how many things there are, testing for it pretty inclusively. And you can get a real honest opinion of what the common is doing, the good points, the bad points, and what you've got to change.
Yeah. So in terms of what you might change, how will it inform what you're doing with the hill sheep and the cows?
Well, the vitamins and trace elements, it's a real eye opener. I mean, I was starting to use boluses, but I've upped the boluses considerably because it's just a demonstrated fact now from the in-buy to the commons that right through the year those animals are struggling on many things, and sometimes you have a bit of wishful thinking and you think, oh, they'll be all right, but that's adding up to a lot of problems with performance. So I've changed my boluses and I've upped the strength of the bolus, and I think that by itself will make a big difference. I mean, without the testing you wouldn't have known.
Would you continue with something like the vitamin B12 injection?
Vitamin B12 is an interesting one. I definitely thought it was really good, definitely good, and I will be using it. But the problem comes when you've got a multiple sort of deficiency, and you've got a vitamin B12 which solves one problem, but you need to use a bolus which has got a 5-in-1 as well, and you can end up having to overdose on one thing to try and correct on others. So it is, but I've got to tailor it a little bit for which group of animals I'm using.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll go over to David. Evening, David.
Good evening.
Good. Worked out all those technology challenges.
Yeah, well, yeah, technology's not the best thing with me on Dartmoor here.
Nor
So
me,
it's getting there.
I just thought I'd ask you about the about the tracking collars, actually. You know, whether that had been useful.
Yeah,
what you've learned from that data.
Yeah, the collars worked very well for us. You know, we weren't interested in the actual sort of zapping them anywhere. We're just interested in where the cows are going, direction they was going, and where they was drinking to, and where they was wandering to. One of my main sort of positive things with the collar is that I could get on the bike with the phone. I could go straight to my cows every time, and stock wise, I know exactly where they're to, rather than always having to get to the top of the hill, get the binoculars out, scan around, go over another hill, look for them, and I can just drive to them, which is just time. For us, time's a big thing for us, and we need to know which way we're going.
Yeah. What about you, Richard? How did you?
Oh no, I
thought
they were brilliant. If I could urge anybody to do anything today, apart from tests, blood tests, is get a collar and put it on a group of animals. Just as Dave says, exactly the same. It saved me so much time. When we get that autumn fog, you lose your animals, you take ages. And one thing I would say, which was really interesting, which I didn't realize when we signed up, is you get maps which show from day activity, week activity, month activity, showing where your cows are. And I feel in the long run, to do with agri-environment schemes, that's going to be gold dust, because it showed how each herd of animals really managed a common.
Yeah. Do you think, in the context of the what's come out of the project and the way the grazers have worked together, I just wondered, what was the value? Was it useful getting together with Harford and Atwell as well, and sort of talking about issues on a sort of a bigger scale? How did that work for you, Richard? Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was nice to sit around in a room. I mean, I don't know what everybody around the country's been doing over the last 4 or 5 years, but it hasn't been the most pleasant time to be a hill farmer, if I'm being honest. There's a lot of strains, struggles and arguments sat around a room. And what I just thought was nice is we talked about farming and livestock, like they would have done in the old days, with a bit more scientific knowledge. So to me, that was brilliant. We just got back to the basics of what we all joined in and started this job for.
David, what have you taken away from the project?
Through all the bits of schemes you have done all through here, the blood testing was very interesting for me. Knowing the selenium side of it, like Richard was saying earlier on, we've been sort of pushing for the selenium side as well as I always use cobalt anyway, but not to know that I don't need the selenium. So our mineral, for the cost of everything that's going up in the world this day and age, for us, keeping at the costs at the sensible price for the minerals, so that kept keeping everything up right for us.
Do you think obviously we've talked a bit about the year one project, which is minerals, but we've been doing a lot of interesting work as well around dung beetles and dung fauna. So I just wondered, do you think there's a need for sort of healthy livestock type work to be more central to the way we design future agri-environment schemes? It seems that from the work we've been doing, there's a bit of a disconnect, isn't there, between the two topics? Richard, I don't know whether you can.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all complicated and interlinked. And you touched on the dung beetle thing. That was fascinating to see how essential our animals were. I mean, I'm back onto the trackers. They proved where the animals were. The dung beetles follow those cow pats and the sheep. And it was really, really interesting, to be honest. And like you say, trying to get all the cogs in the wheel working together, so everybody, I like the expression win-win, and you can get a win-win, but it can be technical. But when you've got the knowledge, you can justify our existence as well.
Yeah. David, is there anything you'd like to add? Or?
Yeah, I think Richard said it all really. It's for us, it's just a win-win situation at the moment, understanding what's up on us on the common here, what's happening up here all the time, and they're giving us proof that our livestock are doing what they're doing up there and being up there. So it's just one of those nice things that happen.
Yeah, so the value of the data, really. I think
Yeah.
just to finish, Sam, because I see you're going to move on. I was just going to say, I think the nice thing for us as a group was actually we felt like we owned the data and that we generated, really good evidence to the level that we fed it into the Thurston review. It changed hearts and minds. We were able to discuss it with politicians. So I think, one of the things that we noticed as we went through the project, there are lots of things that take place on commons, people who do research and different activity, but actually a lot of that information isn't owned or shared or understood by the people who are managing the land. So I think, that was another key outcome for us in terms of the Healthy Livestock Project, was we felt we were actually central to the agenda.
That's really useful, David. Thank you so much, and thank you, Richard and David. And do stay on the line because we've got a few questions in the Q&A for you. I just thought before I went to those, you just alluded briefly to the dung beetle research that you did as well, and how that was picked up by the Thurston report. Which for those who are on this, I mean, I imagine probably most people are aware of the Thurston report. This is obviously the report into the management of protected land, protected sites in Dartmoor. Do you just want to say a little bit, David, about what it was you found through that, and how that fed into the Thurston report, and really the sort of endorsement of 3 animal grazing that came out of that?
Yeah, well, we're just writing up the report, so I'm hoping that in the next couple of weeks we'll publish that, so you can share it around, Sam. But I think what we did was we built a model really to survey for dung beetles. That was robust and repeatable, so that we could look at 2 things. We looked at species diversity, but we looked at abundance, and we did that on the home farms and also on the commons. And then we looked at our vet med treatments across all of the farms to understand what we were doing when and what impact that may be having on the dung beetle community. And as David and Rich implied, we were able to look at tracking information and relate what Clive, who was our entomologist, was seeing in the field with that data. The interesting thing is that with that metric, we were able to look at volumes of dung beetle, and then we were able to equate volume of dung beetle to different species types. So we looked at 3 species grazing, we looked at ponies, we looked at cattle, and we looked at sheep. And what that data told us was that actually sheep by far and away produce the biggest abundance of dung beetles by a significant proportion, and that actually winter grazing was very important in terms of at least 4 species of dung beetle. And the reason why all this was interesting was that the discussion that was being held on Home Common was about destocking, taking all the sheep off for the winter, and that would obviously have potentially that natural England saw benefits for things like dwarf shrub heath. But I think what we were able to do through the work that the commoners and the grazers have been doing was to evidence that if you did that, beware of unintended consequences, because you were going to make at least 4 species over a relatively short period of time extinct, and also it's going to have significant impacts on other issues such as sheep, as an example, becoming much more exposed to louping ill, which is already an issue on commons on Dartmoor. So what we've done with the evidence, really, we didn't take a particular view. We just shared our evidence with the panel, and it was the first time I think the panel had a presentation from a group of farmers where we had current, up-to-date, relevant, scientifically robust information which placed livestock at the centre of a positive biodiversity outcome. And I think that's really important, because for commoners on commons, often a lot of the natural capital benefits are owned by the landowner, whereas we were showing actually that what comes out the back of our animals is driving a lot of those ecosystem services on the common. So that's why
that's really useful. Thank you. I want to just give you a few questions. They're quite technical from the Q&A, but a couple of questions around technical questions around the project. There was a question saying how many lambs were in the pilot group, and also were they all the lambs of the same breed?
Yeah, well, this is these are all good questions. I've got to say that we weren't doing a sort of an institute or university based robust study. We couldn't do that, so we had to accept that there was variation in the lambs. So we had Scotch lambs, we had Swindlehurst lambs, we had white-faced Dartmoors, we had Cheviots. So there definitely are differences in that group. The control group and the treated group were the same size. Not every farm could inject 50 lambs and put out 50 controls. Some of the smaller graziers couldn't manage those numbers. So there was some variation there. But I would say, as a rule of thumb, the results were really interesting, and it did show, I think, a positive gain across, the broad group of sheep. We want to repeat that this year, and I think we've learned a lot from doing the first year. So we would be making some changes, and we might be able to do more of that like for like comparison between graziers that have the same sort of sheep breeds.
Thank you. And then there's two more questions in there. One was, are the group comparing mineral content of their own conserved in-by forage as well in this project? If so, was there a significant difference?
Sorry, could you say it again?
So, were the group comparing the mineral content of their own in-by forage as well as the forage on the common? And if so, was there a significant difference?
Yeah, I mean, the common results were pretty depressing, really. When you were looking at minerals, I think there were only 2 elements that were higher than on the in-by. So yeah, so the common grazings were very poor. The in-by was better, as I said. What we found is things like background levels for selenium were good enough to support sheep. I don't think that the results on the in-by were startling, but they were adequate, certainly, for maintaining the livestock. I think a key takeaway from the whole process, and again, this is quite an interesting one, is that through agri-environment, I think what we've tended to see is that we focus very much on the common. So people have tended to take stock off the common because of the agri-environment schemes, and we've tended to have HLS, ULS agreements where that's tied up a lot of the in-by land as well. So people haven't necessarily aligned or maintained the sort of grassland productive platform. And I think one of the things that we were looking at as the project is there is a need for more investment in that in-by grassland, and that will obviously produce better forage, better energy and protein. And the other thing that I think Peter felt was that if we could hold sheep on the in-by for an extra week, maybe that would make a difference to the colostrum for those ewes going out onto the common, and maybe a little bit more of a focus for us sort of revisiting the management of the pregnant ewe coming up to lambing. So there are a few broader things that I haven't touched on that came out from the report.
Thank you. And then one last question, the last question in the Q&A, and I would say if you could answer it relatively quickly because we're needed to go on to the next one, is someone is just saying they were late coming into the update, and am I right to understand that supplementing selenium is not necessary? And they also add, we started to supplement our common grazed cows as the amniotic sacs was so tough they would not break and had to be cut with a knife. So do you just want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I'm not going to say we need Peter as our minerals expert. But what I would say, the takeaway from the work we did was that you need to understand what your selenium levels are. So don't assume anything. I think we felt that the process of taking bloods, as an example, was extremely helpful to tell us, what condition the animals were in, and then to make decisions from there. So I wouldn't assume that your selenium is the same situation as ours. So I would say investigate. And then, act appropriately from there.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker now, Dr. Nigel Kendal from the University of Nottingham, who's going to be talking about the work that he's been doing around nutrition, sheep and willow. So I will hand straight over to you, Nigel. Thank you. Oh,
I'm muted, hang on.
Yeah, we can hear you now, Nigel. That's great.
Yep, there we go. Okay, yep. Thank you for that. It's very interesting hearing David's stuff, because I don't know whether the two Davids and Richard know. I actually did the blood analysis for them. So onto that, and it's sat there, and just that bit about the selenium. Yeah, you need to test to see whether you've actually got a problem, which element it is. It may be selenium. Iodine can also come into those sort of areas. So some tests would be good on those. And also a few little comments there. I think it was Richard was on about bolusing and going for stronger boluses. Just be careful. As we're saying, we're getting this high over supplementation with selenium. Going for the bigger, stronger boluses isn't necessarily good. And not all the boluses do what they say on the tin. Some boluses don't seem to dissolve at all, and some seem to go quicker than they should. And the comment about posh university trials, I use whatever breeds are on farm, I just balance them. So that's the posh ones. And if you're doing something again next year, I'm here. Talk to me. Right, trees. So this came out of some work looking at minerals in trees. So we'll run through the background and what we're doing. But we did some work with the Woodland Trust looking at the mineral concentrations and energy and protein concentrations of different tree leaves, looking at whether we can use trees for fodder. And going to the cobalt, we found willow here was really high in cobalt. This is a log scale, so we are in sort of about 10 times the requirement. The requirement there, the adult requirement's 0.1, the lamb requirement's given 0.2. Fast-growing lambs might be higher. Equally, the zinc was also elevated, which is a very good general health one. You know, increased, maybe quite good for your orth as well, going into the orth that was mentioned. So we had that high zinc. Again, there's all the different leaves with the energies and proteins, and we were fine with the energy and protein, both for 20 kilo lambs going at 250 or a 40 at 150. We were going to support most lamb growth with tree leaves. And that would have been if we were feeding all tree leaves, not just using it as a supplement to grass. So we had that balanced. Why do we need the cobalt? Normally, we're talking about cobalt going lower. It's when the land's dry, usually it will go low. We also, this common lamb might be low because of the species. Yeah, things like clover will elevate it. It also might depend on the various soils underneath. If you're on a really free draining bit of land, then there's no minerals to come up. So as you can see, across June, July, August, September, we're not meeting the lamb's requirement for cobalt. It therefore can't make the B12. So we're in that region there. So can we use willow as a supplementary feed, and particularly as a sort of biosupplement for cobalt? So we had some lambs. These were a single breed just about, but that's the advantage of working with a 1500 ewe flock. So this was out on farm. 6 groups balanced by weight and sex. Initially in individual pens, later pen and field. This is probably a result of trying to keep weaned lambs in individual pens with 4-strand electric fencing. It doesn't work. So previously wormed and supplemented with selenium and iodine to take that confounding factor completely out of the way. So 3 treatments, each 2 of the groups. One group, they were getting 300 grams a day of fresh willow leaf. So that was about 10 to 15% of their dry matter intake. A drench with 2.8 milligrams of cobalt sulfate. So this is a straight drench on that. So it's about 14 times the daily requirement. And we were looking at this over 14-day period. Hence, we gave that drench and nothing, just controls with nothing. Took bloods at day 0 and weighed them. And again at day 14. And really, we're looking at the B12 concentrations. Just to reiterate, cobalt levels in our grass, below the lamb requirement, in our willow, way above it. Okay, across the whole time. We were feeding in buckets here for control, so we could measure it. I wouldn't recommend necessarily feeding in buckets. There's easier ways to feed willow. The advantage I did have was the student doing this project was 6'4" and could reach lots of trees. So there's our lambs eating out the willow buckets. Yep, certainly. Yeah, we got pictures of them eating. It certainly did eat it. There we go. There's a sort of amount, the percentage of what was being offered was being eaten. When we were approaching 100% most days, there was very little left over. So we were certainly getting consumption of it. Did it work as a supplement? Now, it's a bit of a complicated one. The black line is the B12, so a different group. The yellows are what I call traffic light analysis, and it's basically, if it's red, they're deficient. If it's yellow or amber, they're a bit marginal. If it's green, they're okay. And you can see that we weren't really shifting anything with the controls, with the drench ones, but we took the willow group from being predominantly marginal to all being really good. Yeah, we're up. I would want things to be over 400, and we were up at about 1,000. So we were probably feeding more willow than we really needed to get that effect. So we certainly have it working as a supplement. Other things we need to think about: how much is needed? We can get away with less. When do we need to offer it? Do we need to offer it daily like we did? Can we get away weekly? There might be a case that if you're doing that on a system, you go in every time you weigh. But then again, if you're up on common land, you're not going to bring them in weekly for lay. How can we offer? Just drop branches, cut and drop, grazing platforms. There's all sorts of things we use. And remember, willow responds very well to coppicing, pollarding, and also you can work it in with biomass energy production as well. Other benefits, of course, are feed stuff through droughts. How much was it last summer? Or no, the summer before we had the real drought, and you had the pictures on telly of the yellow field with people complaining they had absolutely no feed for their animals, with lovely green trees around every hedgerow. Lots of fodder up there can potentially be used. So we've got that. Also, there's some anthelmintic properties with willow, maybe the tannins, maybe the cobalt, maybe some other compounds. We've had a look at that as well. And of course, you've got that shelter, shade, and you can use them as hedges and fencing as well. So there's lots of ways we can utilize willow and make good use of it. So that's the people involved. I'll show some willow afterwards. That's Ben, the tall student. He's a vet in practice up in North Yorkshire now. The lab people, Chris at the Allerton project was involved in these, and the other people who were involved in the collaboration with Woodland Trust are there. And the Veterinary lab we run in Nottingham, which also helped fund some of this work. So here's another just interesting thing. Here's some willow that was coppiced to the ground in April, and this is now October, November, and this was grazed. So the sheep are grazing to that height, and we've got about 2 meters of willow here. This is a biomass variety, but it is rapidly growing in something you can utilize. And you can see the lambs are just walking through, grazing up to the height they can. So, okay, and that's the presentation bit.
Thank you, Nigel. Brilliant. And do type your questions for Nigel in the Q&A. I just wanted, there is one question in the Q&A as well. I just wanted to ask you really, Nigel, myself for my own benefit, because one of the things that we're involved in as well in our project is the ever kind of difficult conversation around trees on common land and increasing tree cover. And we've been involved in projects on Dartmoor that are around looking at natural tree regeneration and ways of increasing tree cover. We've been involved in natural flood management projects, which are often using willow on the commons. And I just wonder, is there a relatability of this work to kind of naturally grazed willow forage? Is there a potential that actually increasing the availability of kind of tree forage on common grazing could have a potentially could have a potentially positive benefit?
Yeah, definitely.
As well as this. Yeah.
Jumping in, you've got, as you're saying, willow with its roots are very good for soil retention. You've got that. It's also very good in boggy areas, floody those areas. It's rapidly establishing. It's easy to plant. So you've got all of those bits you can certainly look to. And you've got the cobalt. Yes, they will graze it. If there's enough willow around and your stocking density is lower, they may take little and often, and it may remove that requirement for Smart Shot, because the ewes will be getting cobalt, the milk will be going in. So there is the fact that yes, it certainly would be of use if you managed it as well. You had a little like Willis coppice or something that was potentially fenced off. You could open if you need it, open it once a week, allow them in, kick them out, allow it to regenerate. There may be some management, but I'd imagine in the common situation, the grazing pressure is going to be lower. That you're actually not pushing it. Picking up some of the questions, I can see them popping up.
I'll just answer those. I'll just ask those in case anyone's not seeing them, and because I'm not sure they always pick up in the video.
I was going to read them out anyhow.
Okay,
so
then. You read them out.
Yeah, I'll read them out.
Yeah,
in terms of, did lambs eat bark? Not on ours, because we just fed the leaf in that, but we have equally done a cut and drop. We cut whole branches in and they don't eat the bark. Some people tell you it's breed specific. I think it's just fodder availability. If you've got a lot of forage available, they won't. If they're tight for forage, they may. If they're feeling deficient, they may, because there's other things in bark that can be beneficial. So it is a worry from some people. Do they eat bark? It's not been something I've had too many issues. SRC, short rotation coppice. So yeah, it's what they tend to use for biofuel. Sorry, that's trying to work with coppice people.
What species of willow were you talking about? Because there are different species.
The trial we did was goat willow. So that's what we had was goat willow. But that said, I've seen a high cobalt in every species of willow I've looked at, including the short rotation coppice varieties. So I'm about to say, is there a reason the supplementation drench did not improve the B12? It doesn't tend to on a single one-off on a week. To get a drench to work, you have to be going in weekly. So if you want to go in weekly and do that, that's one of the reasons I think that we might be able to get away with giving access to willow weekly to do that. But we did a trial across in Ireland where we fed weekly, fortnightly, 3 weekly and 6 weekly. And the only one, the best treatment was actually weekly, which was better than the bolus we were using as a positive control. But then they rapidly fell off. So you have to really be going in weekly to maintain that B12. Interestingly, there's some comments about Smart Shot. If you actually look at the dissolution profile, it works. It gives a lot of B12 for the first month and then it drops off, and it's just reliant on passive storage, just the amount you've got there. So I would only trust Smart Shot for a month if you're in a severe deficiency. If you're on a marginal, it's going to take your liver concentrations up, and then there's a bit of passive storage. But it doesn't quite hold up to its six months when you look at that one.
I've also got a question that you won't see in the Q&A because it's from David Atwell, who, as panelists, we can't actually type in the Q&A.
I
just
found
asked
that
me
out
to ask
earlier.
you, yeah, who asked me to ask you, is there a tree species which is good for zinc? Because my understanding is that animals need this daily as it doesn't persist.
Well, willow's good for zinc. That's the one. It's both. It's all, most of the 2+ metals. So it's a metal accumulator. So willow is definitely good for zinc. That said, we don't tend to functionally get too many serious zinc deficiencies. There might be a little bit of marginal there. Things like in his trial, he mentioned the ORF came back, where that could be energy utilization and better energy profiles to mount an immune response to prevent the ORF. So if you're slightly, it's like there were cold sores and things. If you're tired and stressed, you'll get a cold sore. So I think ORF works similar to cold sores in that respect. If it's not quite there, you're going to see more ORF. If you're actually a bit more tipped up on your health conditions, it's not going to be as rampant.
Brilliant, thank you. There was one last question. I'm not sure if you'd addressed this around, I know you give the lambs Smart Shot injection at 3 to 4 weeks and the effect lasts 6 months. Are you giving a second dose for lambs that are retained for breeding or being fattened beyond that 6 months period?
That'll be a David and Commoner one, because
it
it wasn't
be a
my
David
setup.
one, mightn't it? That's beyond.
I would say, I would question whether the effect does last for 6 months would be my answer to that one on there. So you'd want to see it coming back down. The likelihood is as well, if you're talking about 6 months, remember I said cobalt is when it's dry. Hence, once we get to like October, November, it gets really wet. Your cobalt concentration in your grazing goes shooting through the roof. I've been caught out on that on so many trials in the past that I've eventually learned from it. David's got his hand up as well.
David, please do come in and answer that question.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's a good question, Russell. I don't think we got to the bottom of that. Obviously, interested to hear Nigel's views on how persistent Smart Shot is. What I was going to say to Nigel is if we repeated our trials this year, it might be quite interesting to do some bloods or liver analysis to see whether or not we've got those levels beyond the 6 month period.
Yeah, certainly be well worth coming back. I'm just going to reshare the screen because I'm just going to come back to that point because it will quickly on there. This graph here shows the seasonality. Now you see the cobalt comes back up in that October, November, is higher in March, April. So we only actually need to cover that 6 month period. So if we're getting the lambs when they're 4 weeks old, that should really cover them with one Smart Shot. Then they've got the winter and it's not such an issue. Their growth rates won't be so high in the winter. You haven't got the energy and protein concentration going in. And if you're feeding them, you can have cobalt, you can have a mineralized feed.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nigel, for a really interesting talk and a really good set of answers. I really appreciate that. We're going to hand over now to Ruth Dalton from Farmer Network in Cumbria and Karen Swindlehurst, farm vet at Dalehead Veterinary Group in Settle. And to talk about the project that they've been doing through our Upland Commons. And
thanks very much, Sam, and thanks to David and Nigel as well. Really, really good presentations that have had Karen and I plotting to include things in our project as well. So I'll just find the screen share. We're sitting in a rather echoey Dalehead Veterinary Group beautiful building, and I'm very much hoping that Karen, who's on call, doesn't get a call and leave me having to talk about her really techie bit after my bit. So everyone just keep your fingers crossed. Oh, I don't know why we've got to there. Oh dear, terrible. There we go. So hopefully you can all see that. Sam, can you see that okay?
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the project that is really the springboard for the project that Karen's masterminded and that Claire and our common cause are helping us with. This was a project that is now finished that we did over 2 years from 2021 to 2023. And we ran it over the north of England, really, quite a large area. But Karen was definitely my star vet. I hope none of the other vets are on this call because they were all brilliant. But Karen really put so much effort behind it, and we got such good results here in the Yorkshire Dales. So we identified, this was across nationally, there were 3 hotspot areas identified. The For Flock's Sake project, which you do have to be careful saying, was a RDPE funded project, and it was administered by the Morden Institute. And I have to say, the guys from the Morden were brilliant and gave us loads of help through the whole thing. So the Farmer Network, who employ me, we ran the North project, and there was a project run by ADAS in the Midlands and by the National Sheep Association in the Southwest, which everyone on Dartmoor, you might have been familiar with it down there as well. So the project was fully recruited. We had more than 100 farmers, actually. We squeezed in a few extras. And as part of the project, the farmers received farm visits from a coordinator and from a vet, an advisory visit from a vet. We ran cluster meetings, which we were just reminiscing about actually before this Zoom call started, because Karen and I were talking about how those meetings in 2021 were some of the first on-farm kind of meetings where we got people together after COVID. And one of the things that was notable was that nobody wanted to go home at the end of them. We were just kind of, everybody was chatting, and it was such a great thing actually to have a project that brought people together, much as David was saying, you know, just getting everybody on farm. And Richard was saying about talking to each other about livestock. So the key thing of the project that is new is that there is a relatively new blood test for sheep scab. So there were 2 annual rounds of this completed. And the reason a blood test is such a significant thing is that the differential diagnosis between scab and lice is actually quite difficult. And crucially, a sheep can be infected with sheep scab for quite a long time, and I'm talking maybe a couple of months before it shows any signs, by which time that potentially one infected sheep has transmitted sheep scab throughout the flock, and potentially on a common situation throughout the common. So here you can see our 7 farmer clusters. The clusters had to be either commons or they had to be contiguous farms touching boundaries without any significant boundary sort of barrier in between. So I hope you can see up there that there's 3 kind of splats up north of Carlisle into Northumberland. So they were the non-commons, they were all contiguous farms. So I'm going to talk mainly about the commons, which are the 4 at the bottom. And the ones in the kind of southeast, which is the Yorkshire Dales, those were Karen's 2 commons, Ingleborough and, oh my gosh, Karen, the Keyston area. Yeah, thank you. So one of the interesting things about the commons was that everybody who took part, some of our commoners, not Karen's 2 actually, the other 2 commons weren't very keen to take part. And the reason they said they didn't want to take part in the project was that they didn't have a problem with scab and they didn't have scab. And as you can see from this, it just proves the incredible value of this test, because they actually had the highest levels of scab of the whole project. And I think there's a number of reasons that that perception was persisting, really. And the main one was that quite a few people on the commons do dip routinely, which has fallen out of favour maybe in the farms that aren't commons. So all my Northumberland farmers were injecting. There's a lot of problems with the injectables in terms of resistance, wormer resistance, and also environmental impacts. And proper use of dip, much more effective on the scab, much less damaging to the environment. So this is what we didn't see. We didn't see loads and loads of scabby sheep. And actually it was very notable that in every single cluster, all the farmers and quite often the vets were convinced they knew who the scabby farmer was and who was the source of all the sheep scab in the area. And almost invariably, everybody was wrong. And the people who didn't think they had scab, and the people everyone thought had scab didn't have scab. So this blood test is absolutely revolutionary. It's really good for early warnings, really good for preventing you treating your stock when you don't need to. And we did find that generally we had such a great destigmatizing of the whole scab thing as well. You know, when you first started running these meetings, you could tell people were a bit furtive about coming in. They didn't want to be seen going to a sheep scab meeting, but actually by the end of it, everybody was coming to the realization that this is like any other sheep disease, you know, like fluke. You're going to get it at some point. You might as well know how to test for it. You might as well know when you've got it at an early stage. So as I said, it was often associated with the use of common grazings and these flocks that regularly dipped. I don't think we had a single comment at the start of the project where everybody dipped. There were still some people injecting and also some people using sheep showers, which is illegal. So we made that really clear to people as well. But generally by the end of it, there was much more dipping going on, much more use of dipping contractors, very safe, very effective, very legal. And these were just a few quotes before I hand over to Karen from people that took part in the project and some of the vets as well. So one of my vets said she'd had a lot of clients from outside the cluster then pay for the test themselves because they could see the value of it. So it really was a great project, and it acted as a springboard because we had a little bit of funding left over that we wanted to use for more scab testing. And then Claire Braben, who you'll meet in a minute, she offered us a little bit more, and one thing led to another, and Karen's mastermind project was born. So I'm going to hand over to you, Karen.
Hi, good evening. I'm Karen Swindlehurst, one of the vets at Dalehead and Settle. So that's in North Yorkshire Dales. Ingleborough is my workplace. I'm a very lucky lady having to work in such an amazing area. So as Ruth just described, I was one of the vets involved with the For Flock's Sake scab scheme. You do have to be careful how you say that. And Claire came with some more funding, and the Ingleborough project that we're about to embark on came out of that. She asked if we were interested in extending the scheme to further enhance the sheep health for the Ingleborough commoners. It's a fantastic opportunity for us as a practice to engage with the sheep flocks on other aspects of health other than scab. We thought through quite a lot of other options we could offer, but in the north of England, fluke is such a big problem, and every flock has worms, so we're going to be able to affect the productivity if we concentrate on those parasites. So together with Ruth at the Farmers Network, we put together a package where we were going to get an insight into the worm and fluke burdens on the Ingleborough graziers farms, as well as continuing to make the inroads into the scab control that we've already made. Most of the Ingleborough commoners have the scab under control after the 2 years of the project. The breakdowns that we are seeing, I suspect, are due to spread from neighbouring farmers that have infested sheep where the scab project wasn't focused. So one of our aims is to engage these neighbours in meetings and coordinate scab control over a larger area. The project we want to do also incorporates other meetings to discuss fluke and worm controls, individual meetings on farm and individual reporting of results. So we're hoping to highlight how the Scots principles and very targeted sampling can be used on individual farms to help with flock health. We also want to encourage the farmers to apply for the animal health and welfare grants through APHA to maximise the amount of input that we can have on the farms as vets and do a bit more health planning than we do already. In terms of fluke in this project, we're going to be strategically testing for fluke at 2 different points in the year. This slide depicts the fluke life cycle in relation to the seasons. In the late spring, we're going to sample with fecal egg counts to detect chronic fluke. We want to ensure that the flucicides that we've been using have effectively cleared out the fluke from the sheep. And the other time is starting in autumn, we'll blood sample the lambs monthly for evidence of fluke emerging and the disease risk. It's important for us to know when the fluke are emerging so we can dose at the right time with the most appropriate drug. This is a slide I use in a lot of my meetings to explain fluke, the disease that we have, the sampling and the treatments that we can use. At the top, there's a timeline of the fluke in the sheep's liver, extending from when the sheep ingest the fluke until it's mature at 12 weeks old. If there's an awful lot of young fluke around, 2 to 6 week old fluke, we can see a sudden disease where we get deaths or extreme weight loss, and this is called acute fluke. We need to know when that's a risk so that the timings of our doses are accurate. We don't want to be guessing and hoping for the best when we're using our doses. And this is mainly because not all the flucicide drugs we have available will kill the early stages of fluke. At the bottom of this slide, you can see that the drugs are listed with the efficacy of how they kill the fluke at different stages. In many of the farms I work with, triclobendazole, which is the only drug that we've got that kills very young fluke, is now useless. We've got an awful lot of resistance problems. So in a high fluke year, it's critical to know when we can use the next best drug that we have, which is Closentel. It kills most 5-week-old fluke and it stunts some of the younger ones. If we dose too early with this drug, it's not going to be effective. And if we don't dose soon enough, if we're a bit late, we're going to get deaths or production loss. We also have different sampling techniques available to us. We've got some blood samples for antibodies, which detect if an animal has been exposed to fluke. It's measurable 2 weeks post-exposure, so we can tell how long a fluke is likely to be infected. Therefore, we can time our treatments accurately. We sample lambs rather than older sheep because older sheep will have been exposed in previous years. They'll already have antibodies, so the results from them are an awful lot harder to interpret. The technique we use to detect chronic fluke is fecal egg counts, and that's because fluke eggs pass into the sheep's faeces from around 8 weeks post-infection, so we can monitor for chronic fluke through fecal samples. Chronic fluke's the term we use for the longer term disease where we see weight loss and liver failure. These next 2 slides are the results from the lamb antibody blood samples that we've been doing at Dalehead over the last 6 years or so on other areas of the practice. We monitor for this fluke emergence. So we start sampling in July, August time, and we keep sampling monthly or so until we actually have a positive or we run out of lambs that are grazing on the appropriate land. You can see from here that in 2018, which was the first year that we did sampling, we needed to dose in September, October time to avoid acute fluke. We had positives on our monitor farms at the beginning of August, late August and September. And that illustrated to us that the farms differ by significant timescales. So they require treatments at different times, and some of the farms that weren't following our monitoring got caught out that year. These are the results from the last 3 years where the results have been fairly the same in all of these. There hasn't really been very much fluke, even in the last samples that we've taken in December. So these last 3 years have been low fluke years, and it shows to us that the dosing that we traditionally did on a routine basis on the really fluky farms, pre-tupping, was unnecessary. We were using drugs that we didn't need to. We were wasting time doing it and wasting a bit of money as well. In terms of the worm sampling that we're going to do, what we're aiming to do is to do fecal egg counts on every farm to identify when the worms are present and therefore when's the optimum time to dose. We're also going to do post-drench tests to measure the efficacy of the drug and monitor for anthelmintic resistance. The level of anthelmintic resistance in UK sheep flocks really is quite startling. The research on this slide, carried out in Welsh farms in 2015, shows that all of the farms had some level of resistance, and that the white group 1 benzimidazole drenches, there was some level of resistance on all of the farms that were tested. And the other groups, quite worryingly, there was a significant amount of resistance on a number of farms. So the sampling we intend to do is hopefully going to offer the Ingleborough graziers a way to tell about their anthelmintic resistance and hopefully to consolidate good practice. There's a lot of strategies we use as vets in our worm control programs. They all need to be tailored very individually to the individual farm. In this project, we're going to offer fecal egg counts to lambing ewes, which is very good practice in breeding flocks, and hopefully will tell us quite a lot about the health of those ewes and give us another talking point for doing some flock health planning. So that was a really quick whistle-stop resume of the project we're about to embark on. I've almost certainly run over time. I spend a lot of my days talking about scab worms and fluke, and I could witter on for hours. Sorry, I've run over.
You've barely run over at all. That was really interesting. Thank you so much for that, both of you. I'm now just going to hand over to our project officer, Claire Brayburn, and to John Dawson from Bleakbank Farm, who is one of the participating participating commons on Ingleborough, just to talk about their experience. John, can you put your camera on? I can't see you at the moment. Are you there?
No, apparently not.
Oh, is your little slide across at the top of your camera blocked that way? Doesn't matter if we can't see you. Ah, yes, there we are.
There it was. It was. It's a miracle. I'd have had a shave if I'd known the camera was going to work.
Good to see you, John. So, hand over to John and Claire.
Thanks, Sam. Karen, Ruth, that was incredible, and it's given a really good snapshot of what you guys are doing for us on Ingleborough. And I'm really excited to see how this project's going to roll out, and I'm sure John's taken all of that in and he's now really super excited too, hearing about all of those lovely elements of what we're going to be testing on. So I know, John, you're not terribly au fait with the project so far, but bear with us and you will be. So I'm the Yorkshire Dales project officer and working with John quite a lot on Ingleborough, which is a really lovely place to work, just as Karen and Ruth have said. So John, from your perspective, I wanted to ask you, what sheep measures do you and your vet administer already to your Dalesbred sheep?
Oh, well done for mentioning Dalesbred. As we know, they're like any other breed, but slightly superior in every way. We're a closed flock, so we only buy tups. We graze Ingleborough, which is 3,500 acres, with 12 other commoners. We do the usual thing. We pre-tupping mineral, we fluke once a year, we dip twice a year. We're quite naive flock in that we don't do any abortion treatments at all. We've yet to suffer all that cost. So we're extensive. We're not intensive in any way. We maybe have 300 or 400 sheep. So we're quite low key in the fact that our flock is all horned sheep. We expect 1.5 lambs per sheep.
Fantastic. And I know your farm was involved with the initial blood sampling project with Mordon, and obviously the little bit that we've added to that recently. What was involved with that project, and did you think it was a useful exercise?
Yeah, I did think it was useful. I was a bit sceptical at the start, but how it worked was there's 3 gathering points on Ingleborough. We are right in the centre, so there's one either side of us. There's 12 flocks on Ingleborough, and the idea was that we would sample 12 sheep from each flock. And luckily, on a gathering day, we gather 5 times a year. On a gathering day, some of everybody's sheep come through our yard. Not many, but some, enough for 12. So Karen was able to set up shop at Bleak Bank and drink quite a lot of coffee and eat quite a lot of biscuits with help. And all the flocks were able to be tested in our yard and through our sheep pens. It's quite interesting, actually. I didn't just realise it before, but with everybody's sheep going through our yard at some point several times a year, and some of these flocks don't dip or didn't dip or might not dip, that puts our naive flock at some level of risk because they're going through our sheep pen. So I was, as soon as I realised, actually, we do have a risk of sheep scab, I was a lot keener on the project. And it did prove that there were scab antibodies in flocks on Ingleborough.
Yeah,
so it was okay. It was okay.
And how did the other farmers react to them sort of being part of the experiment as well? Then were they knowledgeable to start with, or did you find that quite interesting to get them involved?
Yeah, it was a bit of a challenge to get everybody involved. A family farm is like an insular unit. It's got its own goals. It's got its own strategy. But when you graze a common fell with your neighbours, you've got to have some level of working together. And I did find that bully is too strong a word, but you to say, look, this is what we're doing. We are going to do this. And of course, everybody's frightened of the work. It's a bit like I imagine going to Alcoholics Anonymous and putting your hand up and saying, I've got scab, not alcoholic. No, I'm not alcoholic. Who knows? But it was a challenge to persuade everybody to get involved. And one of the things that did help me persuade those that were a little bit not sure about it was that we could do all the testing at one place. It meant that Karen wasn't tripping around the north of England onto farms all the time. She could do all the testing in a couple of hours at one point. And that was significant, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. And one thing that we're going to try and do more of in the future, not just to relieve Karen's time, but obviously to make it easier to get that testing done. Now, this project is aiming to tackle the 3 major parasites, scab, fluke, and roundworms, in different ways, to gather a bit of a situation on each farm as to how that looks in practice. Do you think that's going to be valuable as well?
Yeah, I think it will, actually. And I think the scab project has opened the door to more testing. Your fluke, for instance, roundworms. I think that we've proved that we can do this thing. We can make it work. And as we all know, information is key. And I've got this little pet project that the farming community is part of the food security of the country. We are a highly respected part of the food production system. You know, you can talk about supermarkets, whatever you want. But we have to protect that. We have to be seen to be proactive, and animal welfare at Bleak Bank, like many family farms, is top of the list. Food production comes second. But if we can prove that what we can do, and I've seen it with the sheep scab project, that neighbours can work together, and it's integral to what we do, really. So yeah, information is key.
Fantastic. But you know, if we can be really honest, what potential obstacles do you think that we might encounter by doing that? I mean, like you said, it's sometimes tricky to get the other farmers involved. What obstacles do you think we might need to overcome?
Claire, I'm surprised. I thought you were always honest. Never mind sometimes.
Always.
Yeah, apathy is one thing in the farming community. We haven't got fluke, we haven't got scab, we haven't got roundworm. And it's the community thing as well. It's a real challenge when you're used to running your own business with your own set of goals and your own timetables, and suddenly you're asked to get involved in something that throws you together with your neighbours. But having said all that, the HLS schemes and various schemes that go on commons have proved that it can be done. And we've had some really difficult meetings in our area, sorting out HLS, money, stuff, mechanics of things. And I've been really pleased in the last sort of 6 or 8 years that every obstacle that's been thrown regarding schemes on a common, it can be dealt with. It can be dealt with a little bit of goodwill and a little bit of gentle persuasion. Let's put it that way.
I think having you at the helm certainly helps that, John. I think
Oh,
that's
I'm not at no helm. I haven't at any helm.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful.
Thank you, Claire and John and Ruth and Karen, and do stay in because we've got some questions in the Q&A. I'll just say to people, Kira is going to launch our final poll, so you'll see that pop up on your screen. Please do answer that. It's just so we can get a bit of feedback on whether you found this session useful. So do answer that, and it will make it go away when you answer it. I've actually just one question in the Q&A for now, which is, have you found that dipping is not as effective regarding fly strike, especially in years like the last two, but appears to be effective for scab and lice? So I don't know whether Ruth or John, you want to come in on that?
John, you better answer because you dipped.
Well, I'm a bit old-fashioned. I've always been a fan of sheep dipping. I've seen showers come and go. I've seen injections come and go, and I think it is just as effective for fly strike and scab
and ticks.
And ticks, yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, I'm not used to ticks. Inglebury isn't a tick fell, but I do take that point actually. Yeah. So yeah, put them in the water, get the dip in their ears, and it's surprising how much you can cure. Trust me.
That's really useful. Thanks. I mean, I had a question as well, which is, I can't remember, Karen or Ruth, if you touched on this. It was just around funding for some of this work. And I know this work is kind of, you know, we've specifically kind of funding this out of our National Lottery funded project, and we're really grateful to lottery payers for kind of coming in and doing this. But that's not a usual mechanism for funding this sort of work. And I just wondered if you wanted to touch on some of the kind of funding streams that are available for people that are interested in kind of taking this up on where they're working as well.
Well, funding is amazing for us as vets to be able to go onto farms and to engage with them from the scab point of view. There is APHA grant money for the Animal Health and Welfare Package at the moment, which we are finding very useful to be able to do a lot of health plans and to get a lot of engagement and help farmers to start to do a lot more of the testing. And yeah, so there is some funding available from there as well.
Yeah, the pathway is focused on roundworms for this time. So if you apply now, it's quite straightforward if you can find the link, which is pesky to find, but otherwise the process is quite easy. And the focus is on roundworms, but we have it on good authority from our friends at Morden that they are lobbying hard to get the scab blood test as one of a suite of things that you can use that money for. So going forward, I think the pathway will become more and more helpful, hopefully. Otherwise, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say it's really useful to know. Actually, there's someone's put a question in the Q&A related to that. So do you think there's a case to put to DEFRA for an animal health top up for commoners? For commons, if everyone signs up? Yeah. And I guess there are additional kind of costs around, additional challenges and additional costs around facilitation and bringing people together. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, just biosecurity as well. I mean, you know, if you're not common grazing, you can double fence, you can be super careful, but the fact that you're grazing a common by nature means you can't be as biosecure. So I think that top up would be totally justified on that ground. Yeah,
I know it's a Foundation for Common Land have been involved in those sort of conversations previously and around the top up for SFI on commons. So actually, it's maybe something we, you know, I will pass on as well to those in FCL who are having those conversations with DEFRA. Certainly no promises, but it feels like there's a case there, doesn't it? It does cost more. It does have more challenges.
I would also say that with the testing, you know, it can save you a lot of money. So although it seems like a cost, if you then don't have to treat because you don't have that disease, or then you treat at the right time rather than blanket treatments, which is what Karen's trying to avoid, then it's kind of a saving, not a cost. And what we have found is that once you've dipped a couple of times, it's habit forming as well, because you see how much better the sheep are doing for all sorts of reasons. I know you're lucky not to have ticks, but we do have ticks over into Cumbria where we are, and I know farmers there who would dip whether they tested positive for scab or not, just from a tick point of view. So once those habits are formed, those treatments can be as cheap, if not cheaper, than the injectables and less damaging for all sorts of reasons. So the economics of it are interesting, and I think funding is part of the story, but ultimately we need to try to understand the value to the farm of doing this testing and using the right treatments at the right time.
That's really useful. Thank you. Oh, was that someone else coming in on that? No, I don't know. That's really useful. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And we've come to the end of our webinar now, unless there's any other questions in the Q&A. No, that's great. That was really useful and really interesting. So it just really leaves me to kind of wrap up and to thank everyone. This is a huge topic, and I think we've only scratched the surface, which doesn't feel like the appropriate thing to say when we're talking about scab. But we are just sort of starting to explore this. But it's really great to see some of the approaches that people are taking, and some of the projects that we've been able to fund, and some of the things that are happening through other funding. So, you know, we know that Ruth's project in particular is still in its infancy, so we will make sure that there's news that comes up about that on our website when we've completed it, so people are finding out more information. There's some links in the chat if people want to find out more of this work. I know Nigel has also put some emails to get in touch with if people are interested in taking this up more, conversations with him. So I really appreciate everyone who's putting in questions and joining us, and we've had some thanks coming in on the chat as well. So thank you from our attendees. So thank you to everyone for taking the time to come and listen to the webinar. Thank you to our speakers and to our participants. Really appreciate it. And do make sure that you follow the Foundation for Commonlands. Do sign up on our website to our newsletter, because we do have more webinars coming up. We're hoping to challenge. I think one of our next ones to be confirmed, but we want to look at some things around finance and common grazing. We've had some really interesting research going on around, you know, what are the costs and the financial outputs of common grazing, and also some work that FCL has been doing around other funding mechanisms. So look out for that, and look out for our other webinars coming up. Really appreciate everyone for joining us, and thank you all, and goodbye. Do you want to stop the recording, Kira?